And then we don't have the possibility to introduce all of us in the call today, but I would briefly like to introduce our lovely speakers here today. So we have Helena Rodriguez. She's the Ocean Policy Officer at the WWF European Policy Office. Thanks, Helena, for joining today. I see your background picture really is on spot today here with the United Nations Ocean Conference. It fits very well because if you go here on the tram in Nice, they have whale sounds at every stop. It's kind of neat. So I was just thinking about that. Hi, Tobias. Tobias is joining from, I think, Copenhagen, Denmark today. He's the team lead for the offshore wind environmental team at the Danish Energy Agency. And then we have my lovely colleague, Anna Miljanovic-Busan from RGI, who is a manager offshore wind and energy at the Renewables Grid Initiative with me. So a very special welcome. We have wait a minute, I need to get to, yeah. So we have a great session lined up, I think. Helena will help us dive deep into MSP in Europe. Then we have a case study from Denmark, from Tobias, and then Anna will talk a little bit on leveraging MSP for nature and people positive offshore wind development. And at the end of our session, you have the possibility to ask questions and we can dive into some further discussions. So I'm really looking forward to this exciting webinar today. And I'm also a bit excited because it's our first big GINGR webinar and there will be more to come, which we will share later. But now I invite you to lean back and maybe have a cup of coffee or a tea and listen to what we have to say and think about some interesting questions. While I will be introducing GINGR to you, my colleague Aston from the comms team is going to place a poll on what is your primary interest in MSP. That would be really interesting for us to know. Now I also see this. So thanks for helping with that. But I'm just going to introduce GINGR really, really quickly because this webinar is on MSP, but you have to understand a little bit what GINGR is about. GINGR is a very young initiative. It has been set up in 2023. It was officially launched at the UNFCCC at COP28 in Dubai. We are a joint initiative by the Renewables Grid Initiative and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We are currently based, our secretariat is based at the RGI premises in Berlin, and we want to work with a very, very collaborative mindset, so to include all possible stakeholders that are interested in this topic. Wait a minute, don't see anymore.
So Annika, you're ending the poll immediately. You need to let people answer.
Okay, but how can I make it smaller? Yeah, okay, sorry.
Any other option than clicking end poll. I'm going to relaunch it one more time.
Yes,
there we go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your patience. So let us do the poll first. So it's quite interesting. So offshore wind development is on number 1 so far. So I think it's still moving. Yeah. So it's the primary interest is both offshore wind development and conservation and biodiversity on the same level. So that's very interesting. So we will hopefully you will get some valuable insights here today. Can I now stop sharing? Yes. Okay. No, share the results. Don't want this. Okay, so back to GINGR is getting here. So sorry about this. So I just wanted to quickly tell you what the Renewables Grid Initiative is, because this is a global webinar and RGI is very European. And since there are a few people from us here on the call from RGI, I thought it would be good for you to know who we are. We are a very unique collaboration of NGOs and transmission system operators. You can see all the logos here. Just to tell you that we are working together on a fair, transparent, and sustainable grid development and renewable energy transformation. And we try to bring both these kind of stakeholders at one table and find solutions. So this is RGI. We are based in Berlin. But what is the need behind GINGR? I mean, I can see it here at the Ocean Conference. It's very, very obvious. There is a triple challenge going on. So we have the climate crisis. At the same time, we need to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Not less important, we need to integrate the people. So a just global transition needs to prioritize the needs of the communities that are actually impacted by the renewables energy development. And this is why we decided together with IUCN to team up to create GINGR. And what are we actually going to do? What is the plan that GINGR has been doing? We have been active now for a year, and we have been working with different technical working groups, which I will explain to you in a minute. But the aim is to create a comprehensive framework that actually will help and allow energy actors to report progress towards biodiversity gains and community benefits. So this is a very it's a very challenging topic and it's very complex, but we hope to be able to sort of share a very first draft framework with metrics at the COP 30 this year later, so in November. And we are aiming to support governments, companies, and the financial sector and hope that they will be able then to achieve their energy, climate, and biodiversity targets. And we are, as I said, we are working with different technical working groups. We have a metrics working group, which is led by IUCN. We have an offshore working group, which is led by the Ocean Conservancy. We have a linear infrastructure working group, which is led by us, by RGI. And there's a people positive working group, which has just kickstarted. Basically, they are just putting together their core working members. And we hope you will be able to hear more from them in the future. Then we're planning to have a monitoring working group later this year and a reporting working group, hopefully in the beginning of 2026. If you're more interested in what GINGR is about, how you can join, please drop us a mail later. We don't really have time during this webinar today to discuss this, but we are very open for new stakeholders, especially from countries outside of Europe. So please drop us a mail and we can maybe set up bilateral meetings at a different point. But now we have really interesting presentations coming up. And that is why I will stop sharing my screen, and I would like to hand over to Helena to give an introduction. So as I said, I'm currently at the UNOC here in Nice, and I have to say that the topic of MSP is at the heart of the agenda. There are a lot of other side events currently going on, also discussing MSP. And yesterday I heard the sentence by a Brazilian colleague saying, MSP is not a choice, it is necessary to protect the ocean. So I think this is already setting a very high level. And it's, well, I don't have to explain to most of you that the ocean is very central to climate and biodiversity solutions. And there's a lot of complexity behind, and there are a lot of players in the ocean. But we want to understand now how we can make sure that the offshore wind expansion is not only supporting energy needs, which are really crucial, but also how can we keep the health of the ocean and how can we involve people. So Helena, I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will share. You can see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, perfect. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helena Rodrigues. I work for WWF, the European Policy Office based in Brussels. And I'm here to present the work that I have done in collaboration with colleagues all over Europe on maritime spatial planning, defining not only what it means, but also assessing the implementation by European member states. So I thought the best way to explain what is MSP is by showing a little animation that we did some years ago. So it's more interactive. Please let me know if you hear it.
From fish to ferries,
Thank you.
seagrasses to ships, whales to wind turbines. Our seas are busy places. But we've overexploited their resources, polluted their waters, destroyed habitats. And the climate crisis is bringing unparalleled changes. To make sure our activities are in balance with nature, we need a tool that considers our complex relationship with the sea. The good news is we have it, and it's called Maritime Spatial Planning. This is a science-based approach that considers all economic and ecological factors of a marine area and involves stakeholders in planning sustainable activities. This gives a voice to those whose livelihoods are tied to our seas, those disproportionately affected by climate change, and those underrepresented in decision-making. Areas are reserved both geographically and over time to all the activities in our seas. As new projects and data emerge, the current plan is reviewed and updated. This approach to managing our seas helps us to sustainably harvest resources and develop renewable energy technologies, while restoring nature and ending harmful activities. Most countries already designate or zone marine spaces, but this is often done on a sector-by-sector basis, failing to consider how activities interact, overlap and affect one another, as well as their impact on the natural world. This can lead to conflicts between sectors and pits human activities and nature against each other. Healthy seas play a critical role to mitigate climate change. They are the largest carbon sinks on our planet, protect our coastlines, and ensure our food security and well-being. Maritime spatial planning is the right tool to plan for a sustainable future by making sure our maritime activities are in balance with nature.
So the animation is available on YouTube and we have subtitles in different languages, so please use it if it's useful for you. So spatial planning started on land. This is what most people associate with planning. However, it started being translated to the sea in the 1990s in the Australia's Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, with the objective of allowing for the conservation objectives of the park to be achieved while maintaining some human activities working. Currently, the majority of the planet's waters already have some sort of plan in place. And over 82 countries have committed to develop and implement plans in their marine jurisdiction. So it is a tool that is being widely used. However, it is important to say that marine spatial planning or maritime spatial planning, there are different schools of thought when it comes to this policy tool. And here in Europe, what we defend, what we support, and it's also enshrined in the directive itself, is the ecosystem-based approach to marine spatial planning. This approach is more comprehensive and holistic because it takes into account not only what human activities we have to allocate over space and time, but also the ecosystem's capacity, meaning how nature can accommodate to the human pressures that we put in place. For an ecosystem-based approach to MSP, for it to be successful, it needs to be based on science. It needs to take into account the ecosystem services provided by the marine ecosystems, as well as the carrying capacity of these. It needs to have an integrated view, understand not only how human interactions, human activities interact with each other, but also how we interact with nature, and the dynamic back and forth between the two. And then, of course, it needs also to bring benefits for the communities that rely on the ocean. Here, what we did at WWF was to go into further detail on what is an ecosystem-based approach to marine spatial planning, because we see this terminology circulating around, including in the European context, but it's never really defined, and it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, which also means that then countries will implement it very differently. And what we see at sea is that an harmonized approach is better at least at the regional level, because of the borderless nature of our marine ecosystems. So we defined 33 indicators across 4 different categories. The first one, and it's the one that is scored the lowest in Europe, is the inclusion of nature. And this is how well the governments or the authorities base their plans on robust environmental assessments, whether it's strategic environment assessments or environmental impact assessments. There's a wide array of analysis that should be carried. We also say that the plan should adhere to the mitigation hierarchy and use the precautionary principle. The activities that are planned, both in space and over time, need to respect the ecosystem's sustainable limits. And then, of course, the plans should also prioritize the expansion of marine protected areas and the connectivity between important biological sites. Then on the socioeconomic considerations, and here we see that it's a group that a lot of stakeholders do not automatically associate with the planning exercise. But for us, it's very important that a plan has objectives in place for the sustainable blue economy, whether it is the phase out of fossil fuels and the planning for offshore renewable energy sites, or whether it is addressing the risks between human activities. And then, of course, the main challenge continues to be how do we plan for activities that are mobile, such as fisheries, which are not located in a specific site and perhaps traditionally are associated with this perspective that they can happen everywhere. And we know this is not the case, but how do we include this socioeconomic data and we bring it into the plans? The third group is ocean governance. And here it's very much how does this policy tool align with the other regulations that are already in place? How does it incorporate them? And then what is there an authority in place that once the plan is developed to make sure that it's well implemented over time? And then final is whether the plan allows for cross-border cooperation, whether it is an adaptive plan, how much are we tracking the implementation of the plan, and then, of course, whether the simple things such as is the entire sea covered, and what are the mechanisms that exist to improve the plan in case something urgent happens. So now looking specifically at the EU, I know Nika does not want me to go into too much detail on the European side, but just as a learning experience from what we found, the EU as the world's largest maritime territory, it ranges not only from continental Europe, but then also the outermost regions that go from the Pacific to the Caribbean, the Atlantic, etc. So it was a challenge, but in 2014, the European Union adopted its Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. It was adopted with the goal of asking member states to put a plan in place, and this plan should help provide goals and help plan spaces for the different economic activities, and also supports planning for marine protected areas and other important biodiversity areas. So, we like to see it as this bigger ball that has all the different little policies inside, because MSP does not replace any sectoral policy. what it does is helps align the different goals and objectives and link it to an overarching strategy, allowing to mitigate some risks and conflicts between the different objectives, but also making sure that nature as a space, and it is considered in the overall objectives of the plan. So by the deadline of March 2021, not all member states had a plan in place, but so far right now, the majority do. So what we set ourselves up was for assessing how the different countries are doing, and then also taking learning lessons from each region, because each marine region in Europe has its own challenges. So we also wanted to understand what were the conditions that made things work, or when it didn't, what could we suggest? This graph is old. It was from when we launched the Mediterranean report. Since then, Cyprus and Italy and Greece has also announced a plan this year. So the majority of the Med is now covered by a plan. We will assess it in the near future. But just to say, looking at the colors from red to green, we can see that Europe in general is not doing very well when it comes to implementing a full ecosystem-based approach to maritime spatial planning. We see that there's some links between the different regions, and this is also a learning for us. How can we raise the profile of, for example, regional collaboration and regional sea conventions in helping the member states have a plan in place? For us, as I mentioned before, the key indicators that are scoring the lowest are usually when it comes to nature, because the majority of member states are lacking on the implementation of marine protected areas aligned with the global 30 by 30 target. And then now we also included, before the nature restoration law was adopted, we already included the need to map restoration sites, but now it's also an obligation. So we will probably see in the near future changes as well in these maps. In general, each region has its own positives and things that could be improved. In the Baltic is the region that scores the best. And we tend to see a very strong collaboration between the member states. The Regional Sea Convention takes well, we should congratulate them, because they are at least organizing these regular meetings and groups where member states experts can exchange between themselves. And this is very good when we want to plan, when we want to go beyond the national level into the regional planning. The North Sea is the region where the deployment of offshore wind is most advanced. The Northeast Atlantic is particularly interesting because it's the region where we also have to map for the outermost regions. So the outermost regions that are covered within the directive are the ones that fall within the Macaronesia region, which is Azores, Madeira, and Canarias. Which all have a plan in place, but it's when you're mapping planning for these expensive areas, it adds further challenges. And then the Mediterranean, there's this focus on marine protected areas, but the majority of marine protected areas continue to not have a management plan in place. So there's a big discussion to have on the effectiveness and the success of these sites. The main challenges continue to be how can, now that we have a plan, and this I think it's important to congratulate and say that in order to improve a plan, we need to have a plan in place. So now that we saw for many countries, the first round of their planning exercises, it's important to start thinking of some key problems that we already saw and will become perhaps highlighted in the future. One of them is how can we include mobile activities such as fisheries, as I mentioned. How do we engage with stakeholders who might not be so present in the policy discussions or the consultations? How do we take their views, and how can we also create this ongoing and meaningful and transparent engagement with stakeholders so that they feel as part of the plan, and they feel their plan can also represent their own activities. And then how in this context of growing pressures, can we set aside space for the protection of the marine environment? We know that the global, the EU and globally, we have committed to delivering 30% marine protected areas by 2030, of which 10% need to be strictly protected. But we need to make sure that the management plans are in place to say which activities are compatible with protection, where, and then to be able to monitor the impact of activities. And this is something that MSP can help, because it gives us a visual representation and also linked to the permitting. We know more or less what is happening where, so it's also easier to monitor the impacts. And then, of course, how do we move from this national perspective into a regional perspective of planning that's taking into account the cumulative impacts of human activities at a regional scale? This slide has a lot of information, but it's just to say that MSP is one tool in a wider ocean governance array. So it's, of course, planning, it's important, but it's also important to work with the coastal communities. It's important to have good conservation measures in place. So it's one tool. It's a very useful tool, but it needs to align well with the other policies that exist and with the efforts of both grassroots and community efforts. So in general, and I think I'm on time, but we would like to recommend, again, the ongoing meaningful engagement with stakeholders to raise awareness about the importance of MSP when a plan is designed and consultations happen. It's important to justify why different measures were considered and how the decisions were made, because this informs civil society as well, and builds this narrative of trust, which is important when we want to continue to engage with these communities in the future. Of course, continue to invest in science, continue to invest in the monitoring of the marine environment. And here, I think Anna will speak a lot about this, so I will leave it to her. Again, we are failing nature, so it's important that we focus on delivering the 30 by 30 target, not only on paper, but in practice, making sure that the marine protected areas are accompanied by management plans and are implemented in a way that delivers the conservation objectives for which they were created. And then to speed up the deployment of offshore renewable energy aligned with the Paris Agreement goals and fossil fuel extraction. And then mapping, and I think this is also a big discussion at UNOC from what I get from my colleagues, there's the role of blue carbon ecosystems. How can we map them and protect them to better incorporate this climate change angle into the plans? And then again, work with the fishing sector to integrate them into the MSP decisions, protect biodiversity, sustain the socioeconomic benefits, and then help fishers transition into a low impact model. I think that's it. I'll leave my email in case you have any questions now, and otherwise happy to speak afterwards.
Thanks so much, Helena. Can I just ask one follow-up question? Because you said you had this map and some areas, especially in the Mediterranean, were black. And now you said this has changed a little bit, just because I also think a lot of the people joining today are not 100% familiar with the concept of MSP. So can you just say quickly, because you said things have changed, how long it usually takes for an MSP to be installed by a country, or until when would WWF say, okay, now we are satisfied, so it turns into a different color? Like,
okay, sorry, I will share the map again just so we all see it. This is what the map you were.
Yeah, exactly, because you think you had the
yes,
change.
so I didn't explain this, and it's a great point. So in black are all of the countries without the plan in place. What we did is, after the deadline set by the European Commission to have a plan in place, then we started assessing the implementation for the member states that were late. And this report was launched in 2023, so already over 2 years after the deadline by the European Commission. There were still 4 countries in the Azores without a plan in place. Since then, since 2023, Italy last year and Cyprus already have a plan in place as well, was adopted last year. And then Greece announced its plan this year, and Croatia is still missing. So just, you know, black is not an assessment color. It's just to say there was a lack of a plan. In terms of how long it takes to make a plan, I guess I will also leave it to my Danish colleague who understands better the national context. But what we see is the directive was adopted in 2014. And by 2021, some member states still did not have a plan in place. So it can take quite some time to do a first round of the plan, and then afterwards to work on the adaptation of the plan. Maybe it's less burdensome. I don't think it is, because once you have a plan, all of the stakeholders raise everything that else that needs to be done, and then you have all of the new policies that come up and need to be integrated into the plan. Of course, 2014, for example, was before the Paris Agreement. So afterwards, during the first planning round, you already had the targets of renewables, which were not foreseen when the directive was adopted. So there's this ongoing need to adapt the plan. The most important part is to have one in place so all stakeholders can see. We can do the first assessments, the first exercises, and then discuss collectively what is the objective that we have for the sea, and what are the priorities, and how can we allocate the space over time as well for the different activities.
Okay, thanks for clarifying this, because I think being a very global audience, this might be interesting to understand. Okay, so then I see the question here. The recording is going to be shared. It will be available on our website, so you can also have a look at it later. Yes, it will be on the GINGR website. We will tell you. Then I would like to give the word to Tobias to share his insights on MSP from Denmark, and with a special focus, of course, on offshore wind. Thanks for joining today.
Can you hear me?
Yes, all well.
Good, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I will just share my screen now. Hopefully, it will work.
Yes, it works.
Great. Annika said she's a strict moderator, so I've tried to.
I included some buffer. You can see we're already. That is good.
Okay, great. Just a little more background. I've been working at the DEA with environmental permitting and environmental assessments and marine spatial planning for 6 years. But before that, I worked with spatial planning on land, and I also teach spatial planning and planning law as a part-time lecturer at the university. So it's a topic I could go on with for hours. I just want to give you a brief introduction to how we work with MSP at the Danish Energy Agency, and a couple of things that I think were important. And then I hope we will have time for some questions, because of course it's a huge task doing spatial planning for offshore, so much offshore wind in a marine world, which is both home to other human activities and to vulnerable ecosystems and species. I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk from a Danish perspective, and Helena also briefly touched on it, then that marine spatial planning is something different than spatial planning on land. Even though we want perhaps to be kind of the same thing, we have a much longer planning tradition in Denmark on land, which means we have a precedent, we have a proven relationship between spatial planning and environmental protection. An example could be we have guidelines on spatial planning and protection that have evolved over the years. So you might say that spatial planning on land and environmental protection on land has grown up and matured together. But this is not the case when we talk about maritime spatial planning. Spatial planning on land, like in Denmark, goes back almost 100 years, while the MSP directive is only 10 years old. And the same goes for environmental protection. It also goes back almost 100 years in Denmark on land, but has, you might say, lagged behind with the marine environmental protection. And the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is really the first comprehensive protection of the marine environment, is not even 20 years old. So I just think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about the task we have ahead of us on marine spatial planning. I also just included here a view of what does the Danish Maritime Spatial Plan actually look like. To my knowledge, it's the first digital executive order in Denmark. So you can visit it online on havplan.dk. And it consists of some development zones that cover different projects, offshore projects like raw material extraction, renewable energy, fish farming, other projects, other infrastructure projects as well. And then we have some zones that are not, you might say, it's not project construction zones, but it's zones with specific spatial interests, shipping corridors, nature protection areas, protection zones around airports, as an example. I will not go into very much detail on the MSP, but if you haven't visited, it's a good opportunity, since it's available digitally, but only in Danish, unfortunately, I think. We've been doing MSP at the Danish Energy Agency long before there was something called Maritime Spatial Planning. Our earliest planning exercises for offshore wind actually goes back to the late 80s, where we also, of course, back then when we planned for offshore wind, it was smaller projects and it was isolated projects and not a lot of projects. But we also engaged in stakeholder involvement and investigated and adapted to other spatial interests. Then in the late 90s, we saw what we call the first actual spatial plan for offshore wind, probably. There was a target for 4 gigawatts by 2030. And that's where we started to see like what we might call real spatial planning. But of course, the ambitions now are far greater. If we take the Ostende Declaration alone, I think we approach 300 gigawatts of the capacity stated in the Ostende Declaration for the North Sea alone. So it's
Tobias, maybe the Ostende Declaration, maybe you can say a few words, because I saw there's a lot of people from China, India, maybe they don't.
Oh, yeah. The Ostende Declaration is a follow-up on what we call the Esbjerg Declaration, which is a declaration among the North Sea countries to commit to the renewable energy development of the North Sea, and also mentioning in the Ostende Declaration the health of the marine environment. So it's basically a political declaration saying that we will strive to achieve these very ambitious offshore wind target, while also taking into consideration the health of the marine environment. And of course, the challenge now is increased vastly in scale and complexity. So we have to achieve these very, very large renewable energy targets in a world compared when we go back 30 years. We have much stricter rules on environmental impact assessments, for example. We have stricter rules on environmental protection. We have an increase in the amount and pressure level from other human activities, or at least we have a greater awareness what the impacts are from these activities. And on several parameters, we have decreasing environmental conditions in the marine environment. So it's all these things put together. It almost takes my breath away sometimes. So that's what we are dealing with when we talk about spatial planning for offshore wind. Vastly increased targets and a vastly more complex assignment than what we have seen before, and which has really escalated in the last couple of years. Going back 10 years, the ambitions for offshore wind was much less. So we're actually doing this. The need for marine spatial planning is increasing while we are still developing the environmental protection of the marine environment, because the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is also not fully developed, you might say, yet. There's still a lot of threshold values that need to be agreed upon. So it's sort of like laying the tracks while we drive, you might say. This is just a slide showing the approach to spatial planning before the MSP. We got the Danish MSP 2 years ago in 2023. But as I said, we've really been doing maritime spatial planning for almost 20 years when it comes to offshore wind. This rough screening was an exercise we did in 2017, which was the first time that we really needed to designate very large areas for the future offshore wind. And at the same time, the work on the MSP had started back then. So this was also an input to the MSP. It's really the same authorities that we are involving now as we did before we had the MSP. The spatial planning exercise hasn't really changed that much just because we have an MSP. We still have some areas that are off limits to offshore wind. We have some areas where it's not a restriction, but we need to take certain considerations. Offshore wind in those areas might present a challenge, which might be overcome, which might not be overcome. But I think what really has made a difference is that we now have this centralized tool for doing it in the MSP, describing the procedure, and you might say legitimize this planning in a broader perspective. Spatial planning before the MSP was something we did according to our own legislation, and it didn't really have any legally binding effect for the other authorities. They might not be able that we were actually reserving these areas for offshore wind because they might be reserving them for something else. So of MSP has not really changed, but MSP really present a tool for coordination and this centralized approach or centralized system where authorities and the different interests can meet and engage in this dialogue, you might say, on how we should develop and proceed with the spatial planning. And this really, I think, brings me to one of the my main points on successful maritime spatial planning, which is the importance of communication. And communication that really lasts through the entire planning process, but also really beyond planning when we move from a planning phase to a permitting and environmental impact assessment phase. And I think it's something we've been quite successful at in general here in Denmark, maintaining a relatively fast and effective dialogue, both formal and informal. And the informal aspect, I think, is very important, both with stakeholders and with other authorities in the different planning phases. And this is part of what we call the Danish one-stop shop approach, which has been like the Danish Energy Agency's way of approaching spatial planning for a number of years. It's also important to remember that maritime spatial planning is not only about looking at other activities offshore. We also have stakeholders that you normally associate with land, with spatial interests at sea. We have environmental impacts from land that affects our ability to plan at sea, and land-based sources that can impact our planning. So that's also a really important aspect to keep in mind. Another important aspect, and which is one of the key reasons that this dialogue is so important, is that we can't always, as energy authorities, discern what consequences our planning have for other areas. We might see that there's a nature protection area or a shipping corridor, but actually what the impact is not always clear to us. That also goes for something like commercial fishing. And this, I think this is a particularly important topic, and something where you really see the concept of MSP coming into play. And last but not least, I think another, you might say, facilitator or driver for this communication is that we have had a very strong mandate through political agreements on offshore wind, which is really important for facilitating this dialogue between authorities and stakeholders. Getting other authorities and stakeholders to spend time engaging this dialogue throughout the process. It can be time consuming, but it's much easier to get the resources prioritized when you have a strong mandate backing you. I think this is a case I brought, a special planning case, which is kind of peculiar and perhaps underscores some of my points about communication. We had this we call it the old Hesselø site, which was being planned for tendering during 2020 and 21. The site was located in Kattegat, and a number of things happened to this site during the planning process. First of all, this area turned out to be a very important trawling area for Norway lobster. And even though this was identified quite early in the planning process, the amount of stakeholder involvement we saw and political engagement in this issue came as a bit of a surprise. So even though we kind of identified that this was an important fishing area, we perhaps weren't aware of the particulars regarding that area. Who were the stakeholders? How was this area? How should it be seen in relation to the other fishing areas in Kattegat? And for this area, also related to spatial planning, we also discovered while actually doing the planning and after the initial screening phase, where we thought we had dealt with all the necessary spatial interests, suddenly we discovered that there was a ferry route which had been established between Denmark and Sweden that went right through the middle of the area. And again, this underscores the importance of keeping the dialogue all through the process, because offshore wind projects are so large that they are many years underway, and a lot of things can happen during that time. But because we had this very close dialogue with other authorities, we knew where to contact. We had some very good contacts. It also enabled us to quickly try to handle the issue and engage in a dialogue with the Danish Maritime Authority. It turned out that actually this area was not really suited for offshore wind due to muddy seabed to quite a great depth, making it unsuitable for some types of foundation and jack-up vessels. So in the end, we deemed the area not suitable. And that actually led us to another aspect of spatial planning, because there was a suitable area south of the current location, which is the bottom map and the red circle, but that was part of a defense exercise area. So we started to engage in a spatial planning exercise with the Danish defense to see if we could move to that area, and if it was possible for them to move their existing exercise area, or perhaps if they didn't need it anymore. And it was a very long dialogue, but it also showed that the importance of this political mandate in the spatial planning, because we were able to have a very fast and effective dialogue with the Danish defense. And it actually ended up with us getting a part of the area.
Yes, so in order so we can have still time for discussion, I would like to ask you to wrap it up a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I just have a couple of slides. It's just to show that we have actually started, and I think it's one of the main points, because communication is not the only thing that's important for spatial planning. Knowledge is also the key, and we are currently doing a large-scale screening and environmental mapping, which really will be able to make us able to do smarter decisions on offshore wind, identify areas with the fewest environmental conflicts, interests, find the most suitable areas, and use it as an early warning, and support the long-term planning and decision making for offshore wind. And it's both an environmental scientific mapping, which is quite comprehensive, but we also couple that with the geological mapping of the suitability by the seabed, which I think makes it quite unique in an international perspective. So we try to like both take the environmental perspectives, the marine spatial planning interests, as well as the suitability of the seabed for foundations, put all this together in an interactive map and see what we come up with. What areas are we identifying as the least challenging, and what areas do we expect certain challenges? And it will wrap up here by 2025. So I can't show you that much. This is just a couple of examples of the sensitivity mapping we're doing. This is on seabed habitats, where we try to identify high sensitivity and low sensitivity. We also have these are two maps on fish sensitivity and sensitivity for harbor porpoise. So yeah, I can wrap it up now, but I hope there will be some questions. And this sensitivity mapping exercise is done in English for a large part, so it should be able to navigate it quite easily. And there's already a lot of sensitivity reports published on the DEA's website.
Thanks, Tobias. I mean, looking at the maps of Denmark, you can already, understanding how small a country Denmark actually is, and you can already see how busy the Danish and especially the Kattegat Sea is quite incredible. So this is really helpful, interesting, and I hope we have some discussions later about this. So then I would like to ask Anna to go ahead with her slides, and then we can start to have a discussion. And to the audience, please, if you already have, you can start to drop questions in the chat box, and we will be happy to try to answer these later.
Yes, hi everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen now with the slide. Great. So yes, as already introduced by Annika in the introduction, I'm Anna Milanovic-Rusan. I am humorously Croatian without a maritime spatial plan, but I work in RGI as a manager in the offshore team and we work on offshore energy and nature. So I've been listening to presentations from Helena and Tobias, and for instance, Helena mentioned challenges about nature restoration, and Tobias had this very nice slide with the what MSP has this role with this box and what has to be put in all of this box. And one of the things that has to be put in the box was a vision. So with this presentation, I would like to present how can maritime spatial plan go beyond And what if the vision of the maritime spatial planning can be to have a nature and people positive offshore wind development? So the things that I'm going to present today are actually discussed in a lot more detail in this GINGR Navigator. It's a report on maritime spatial planning that we launched in November 2024. So if you're interested in a lot more details, you can obviously visit the paper later. And accompanying this report, there's also a checklist where we kind of summarized all of the most important things that a nature and people positive MSP should have to kind of make it more user-friendly. But without further ado, one important thing to clarify is that this report and all of the knowledge that I'm going to talk about now actually is based on the knowledge that we already have produced throughout the years in the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, which is, for those who don't know, a coalition of offshore wind developers, grid developers, and environmental NGOs. We currently have two coalitions with the same goal, which is the accelerated but nature-friendly offshore wind and grid deployment. And the main difference between the two coalitions is their geographical scope. So there is the North and Baltic Seas Coalition that is already here for a while. And recently we launched the Mediterranean Sea Coalition as well. But now let's go back to the content. So before I go into the how do we achieve this nature positive and people positive MSP, it's important to clarify what we mean by these terms. So nature positive MSP. As already mentioned by both Helena and Tobias, nature protection, especially considering the health of our seas, be it North, Baltic, Mediterranean, you name it, they're in a very poor health. So MSP should have this role of managing the human activities in a way that avoids damaging ecosystems. However, as already mentioned, we also have to be have a more proactive role in this. And MSP should probably also go in the direction of nature restoration. So this is where we think about nature positive MSP. So MSP should think about how to allocate enough space for nature restoration. So going beyond just protection or avoidance and minimization of impacts. So this is on nature positive side of things. But then we also have people positive maritime spatial planning. So Tobias, for instance, mentioned the stakeholder engagement and involving different sectors during planning. And it's not only about involving, it's also about hearing and giving them the power to influence the decisions on how the spaces allocate in the sea basin. It's also not giving only power, but also bringing benefits. So this is going a bit beyond just finding the common ground and maybe mitigating the conflicts. In the paper, we try to define what are the tools that maritime spatial planners can use to achieve both nature positive maritime spatial plan and people positive maritime spatial plan. So these are just some of the tools and that we see on the slide, such as strategic environmental assessment, cross-border and trans-boundary cooperation, dedicating space for nature recovery. Then on people positive, it's the stakeholder engagement, multi-sectoral approach. But because of the limitations in time, I'm going to focus only on 3 specific tools in more detail. So first of all, on nature positive, one tool that I like to focus is cumulative impact assessment. But let's take a step before. So accompanying maritime spatial plan, the maritime spatial planning process, there should be strategic environmental assessment. So what is a strategic environmental assessment? It's a procedure that assesses the environmental impact of a program, plan, or policy. So when the maritime spatial plan is being done, you should do this in parallel. So you should assess the environmental impacts in parallel. And it's usually done by a public authority through a desktop research. And you're assessing different alternatives that you can have in the maritime spatial plan. And by the end of this, you produce an environmental report claiming why did you decide to have this kind of scenario in your maritime spatial plan. And it obviously takes into account the broader geographical coverage of the sea that you're planning and with the long-term focus. Now, within this, ideally, you also do cumulative impact assessment. So what are cumulative impacts? So according to the definition that I borrowed from the International Finance Corporation, cumulative impacts are total impacts resulting from the successive, incremental, and/or combined effects of a project when added to other existing, planned, or reasonably anticipated future projects. A lot of words, but let's try to think about it in a more clear way with this illustration. So we have a lot of activities taking place at the sea. And each of these activities then produces a bunch of stressors or pressures, however you want to call them. So, for instance, shipping, it can get oil spill can happen. It can be release of contaminants. It can be the noise pollution. Then all of these stressors then have impacts on ecological components, so on environment. But when you think about cumulative impacts, you have to think about, okay, all of these activities have impacts on environment, but all of these activities also have impacts on each other, and the stressors have impacts on each other. And these impacts can be positive, negative, direct, indirect, long-term, short-term, and all of this is cumulative impacts, basically. Now, it's a very complex thing, but if you really want to plan in a nature-friendly way, you have to do it. And there are obviously some challenges, such as data availability. So not all data is available or accessible, but data is a prerequisite for every step in maritime spatial planning. So what kind of data do you need? How is this data stored? There's obviously a lot of questions that we try to address in the paper. So if you want to have a look and not learn more, you can have a look there. But this is just one of the challenge. Then baseline. So what is the baseline? What is the environment that we consider is the baseline and we want to reach? This is also something that is very, very relevant when you try to define what nature positive means. I think we're all aware of this shifting baseline syndrome, which is that with every generation, we get used to the more and more degraded environment, and we think that this is what the baseline is, but it's not. There's a baseline of the state of the environment that we should try to achieve that is not this current state of the environment, that is not the current state of the environment that is now pre-development of offshore wind farm. So this is where nature positive comes into play. Then what is another challenge is the interaction between activities and stressors. So for instance, noise emissions are not coming only from shipping. They're also coming from, for instance, fishing. They're also coming from offshore wind farm construction. So there is also not necessarily a linear connection within this. So you have to think about the interconnections. Then choosing appropriate spatial and temporal scale. As you probably all know, seas don't have boundaries. Nation states have boundaries, but they don't necessarily overlap with the ecosystems. So when you do your cumulative impact assessment, when you do your maritime spatial plan, you have to think about how to do this to reflect the actual ecosystem and environmental reality. And then significance determination. What does that mean? Not every single drop of chemical is necessarily leading to a wide scale detrimental impact. However, it's important to understand, this is obviously oversimplification, but it's important to understand what does it mean to have a significant impact. And this is also another question within cumulative impact assessment that should take place. On the right-hand side, you can see just an overview of cumulative impact assessment tools that are already available or being tested. More information on them can also be found in the report. Another tool for nature positive maritime spatial plan is siting of offshore wind and grid infrastructure. So it's important to say, because this is, after all, about offshore wind and grid, that siting your maritime spatial plan is the most important tool for avoidance and minimization of environmental impacts that developers and authorities can do and are doing. And it should be done in a way that is based on some scientific tools and methods. Tobias already mentioned sensitivity mapping. And this is one of the things that we are also in Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature also try to advocate for, that is being implemented. Right now, during Maritime Spatial Plan, what is considered when you're siting offshore wind and grid is that you can achieve maximum electricity generation, but in a way that minimizes conflicts with other sectors and protects the environment. And here, for protecting the environment part, it's really important that you use sensitivity mapping. This is on maritime spatial planning level. Obviously, there is also a level of project planning. And on this, we as a coalition already wrote a report and prepared a database, and I hope maybe it's shared in the chat. If not, I can share it later in the chat, where you can read more about the more than 80 avoidance and minimization measures that we identified as a coalition. Last but not least, people. So sometimes I feel that in the conversations about energy transition, people are left out. Not only energy transition, but also nature protection or restoration. We don't want to have this, obviously. And for this, people positive maritime spatial plan can provide a guideline how to reach this. So especially when it comes to offshore wind, people think that because it's offshore, there's not so much opposition. Or for instance, all people who are opposing offshore wind, they're simple not in my backyard people. But this is not the case. It's more about ownership, being included, having the right to say what's happening really in your backyard. And for that, the concept of energy justice is very, very useful. So energy justice, or very simply said, energy transition that doesn't leave anybody behind, for maritime spatial plan would mean that you build trust, first of all, through stakeholder engagement. Research and experience have shown, and what Tobias also said, early, proactive, and inclusive stakeholder engagement is key. Who you have at the table is one thing, but the other thing is also how much influence do you give them. So people really need to feel seen and also understood, and also have the tools to participate and also give their points in the decision. How do you do this? The format of the stakeholder engagement obviously will depend from country to country. It has been shown that the more interactive and user-friendly tools should be used rather than like a top-down decision. It's not only about understanding, as I already said, conflicts and what are the social impacts. It's also about creating benefits and also finding synergies. So, for instance, to address social impacts, it would be useful to do socio-economic impact assessment, where you look at the different sectors. There are the impacts on different sectors where based on different alternative scenarios, and then you reach a common ground. One important thing is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So you have to understand the local context. And in how to do this is only if you communicate with the local stakeholders. Here on the slide, you can see this graphic summarizing the aspects and dimensions of energy justice. We go in more details about this in our report, but also in another project called Just Win for All that is going to have its webinar next week. So if you're interested in more details on this, I would invite you to participate. So I don't want to take more time. I would like to allow for discussion. So I would like to wrap up my presentation with this. Thank you for your attention. This is my email, and stay here for the Q&A as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. I think this was very insightful, and thanks for highlighting the necessity of nature positive and people positive. And I also really have to say I was in 2 side events here yesterday where the focus has been on people positive explicitly, and especially countries in South America have this as a very strong key consideration. And yeah, so this would lead to my first question. I see there's one question. I will get to that in a minute. But since I've seen we have people from very different countries here on the call, from Chile, from China, from a lot of them are inside Europe, but also from India. And yeah, some people didn't write from where they're from, but I think we're quite a global audience. So what can we learn from the challenges that you have all already described in your presentations? And maybe Helena, you can look a bit more into this because you looked at Europe in general. What can other parts of the world learn from the challenges that have been lived through in or have been experienced in Europe, and how can this help other parts of the world to move forward with MSP, maybe even more efficiently?
I think that's a very good question. A very challenging one to answer because it's so broad.
Yeah, but maybe you have an example, or maybe you can say what the challenges, what are the challenges that are still remaining, and maybe highlight those that can be tackled from the start already, you know.
Yes, so for us, it's very clear that a good spatial plan is one that considers nature and helps nature to thrive. So when we see the continuous degradation of the marine environment, and we strongly support any plan that takes this outlook from the beginning. So not only mapping sensitive sites, but also making sure that marine protected areas are well connected, taking into account, for example, the latest research on the cumulative impact, making use of robust assessments, as Anna mentioned, strategic environment assessments, environmental impact assessments from the beginning. And then having, I think it's also quite important to define objectives for the plan to be achieved, and then monitor the implementation of these over time. So that's when the second round of the spatial plan comes, then we can see what has worked, what has not. And this is also what in the U we call this adaptive approach. So I think that's the main point. And then of course, we've talked about nature positive and people positive, but sometimes we also hear the term climate smart. And this is something that we need to consider: what will be the impacts, how climate change is changing the ecosystems, and how our pressures are then adding even more into fragile ecosystems. And then, for example, how will some of the ecosystem services change over time with climate change, for example, where people fish, or the migration of some species. So I think all of these are additional uncertainties. But I think the best way to start is to start. So the best way is to go for it and start thinking about the plan, helping, making sure there's a broad consultation of civil society and the different sectors is involved. And yes, I think it's a very broad question that could be here for a day.
But Anna, maybe you want to add something, because you looked at the cumulative impact assessments, and when it comes to these, what do you think is still needed? I mean, looking at Europe, but also looking on a global scale, what is missing?
Yeah, so specifically on cumulative impact assessment, I mentioned a lot of challenges, but that doesn't mean that there should not be attempts to develop something as best as you can. I personally am aware of this attempt right now in OSPAR, which is like Oslo, Paris Convention or Commission or however, but it's OSPAR called, where you have nation states from the North Sea trying to figure out now the cumulative impact assessment tool that could work on a sea basin level. And I think this is something that should be obviously worked on and developed, and also taken as inspiration for other sea basins. So considering all that was said about scales and the need to collaborate between nation states, I think this is a way to go, honestly. Obviously, there's no perfect tool. I don't think it's going to be possible to develop a perfect tool, maybe not now, but initiatives like these are a step in a good direction, I would say.
Thanks. And maybe Tobias, since Denmark has shares sea basins with Sweden, Norway, Germany. Yes, those are the ones. What are your experiences in sharing and or maybe working on MSP together?
I think right now, I think we have to be honest that the MSPs don't really have that much of a transboundary element. To my knowledge, most of the MSPs are focused on the national developments, but may have some sort of transboundary aspects. And I think this work in OSPAR that Anna mentioned, which is something we're also following closely, is really important because we having a planning tool that spans borders perhaps might not be of the best use if we don't have the tool to assess whether our combined impacts are acceptable, or where do we need to scale down on the impacts, or where can we see that perhaps we have some other sectors creating impacts that will cause that will prevent offshore wind development, which we really want. So I think we can't. I don't think you can separate MSP from this cumulative assessment tool that is being developed, but that is also a challenge because there's a lack of data. There's a lack of, agreement on how should we approach it. Is it even possible to have a tool that can make comprehensive cumulative impact assessments? So I think we should view the development of this tool and the need for MSPs perhaps to be a little bit more transboundary, or we need to work more on a sea basin level. I think is a general consensus between the countries also in the North Sea Energy Cooperation, not only for the marine environment, but also for the development of offshore wind, because if we don't talk to each other and get to know the impacts, the cross-border impacts, we are not able perhaps to do smart spatial planning.
I see Søren's question. Maybe Søren, do you wanna go a bit more into some specific question, or should I just read it? So it's sort of touching on what you just said, but maybe we have some more answers to this. I don't know. Can the panel comment on the use of MSPs as a potential tool in transboundary reality of the seas? For example, how it can be used for maximizing net value in transnational dialogues. That's very specific. But Tobias, if you don't have more answer on it, I don't know, or
I think the MSP is a really important tool addressing the transboundary reality, as Søren calls it. But I think there's also, we need to find out whether there should be a stronger incentive to do this transboundary work on the MSP, because it's very much up to the individual countries in the MSPs right now to coordinate in border zones. You might say that the situation, I think some would say that the situation calls for a stronger incentive to actually cooperate more closely on a sea basin-wide level on the MSP.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also something I know that has been discussed on a commission level at one point. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's move on. Maybe Carly, you please feel free to also ask your question in person. Maybe it's nicer to chat.
Hello, hi, I'm Carly Brooks, representing the Wildlife Trust from the UK today. Thank you for your talks, they were really interesting. I think one of the interesting points that came across, which is obviously slightly different, and it was Tobias that brought it up, you pointed out that a strong political mandate was really essential in maritime spatial planning. But as you're obviously all familiar with, there's going to be a lot of industries out in the sea, all with their different priorities, and they're seeing, how is it that you've achieved a strong political mandate, when there's powerful lobbying from those industries, somebody needs to take a kind of a high level, I don't know, a way of prioritizing those, if you see what I mean. How do you get your government or somebody in charge to say, right, it's actually going to be wind over fishing over, you know, I don't know. It's incredibly difficult to get that balance, to achieve that balance, to achieve that prioritization. I was wondering how you have actually gone about that. How did you achieve a strong political mandate? That would be very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, perhaps I should clarify a bit, because the strong political mandate I was talking about was really in relation to the offshore wind development specifically. But I think it's something that has evolved. But it's, I don't know what you might call it, a planning tradition, but I mean, the way it manifests, for example, is that if we are engaged in a dialogue with another authority or some stakeholders, and we need some sort of political engagement, it's easier for us because we have these broad political agreements. So when you have a broad political backing, it's obvious for everyone that this has a high political priority. I'm not really sure how to achieve it. I think it's something that has come gradually. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's not much of an answer, but
it's very, very tricky. I think that's why you know, maritime spatial planning has been very difficult for us to achieve, to get those priorities sorted and to make some definite decisions. So all of this has been really interesting to take back and try and get that sorted out and get those layers sorted and those priorities sorted. Thank you so much.
But I guess you could already see from your case, Hessele was the case, right? That was very interesting to see, because then the ocean is so packed with activities, and I guess at that point it's then also up to the political decision makers to say, okay, now this is not going like you planned it originally. So yeah, there needs to be a say. I see there's one more question from Sebastian. Yes,
if I can
Helena,
just chip in. I think it's also important to put spatial planning in the broader conservation agenda, and to remember that target 1 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the target 1 says plan and manage all areas to reduce biodiversity loss. And this was adopted by the majority of the countries around the world. So there's already this political momentum or mandate in the Biodiversity Convention to use spatial planning for biodiversity. So I think we should also not forget the overarching ambitions that we have all signed.
Yeah. And I think this goes quite, we should make the connection a little bit more to offshore wind again. So I think this last question is fitting quite smoothly. Should implementing an MSP be a prerequisite to be fulfilled before developing offshore wind projects? I would say, I mean, I guess the answer is on the table, but someone wants to elaborate a little bit on this, maybe Anna or Tobias.
I can give.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so yes, I would definitely agree with the statement. It's not only preventing a lot of conflicts between sectors and also citing offshore wind in a very early stages in a nature-friendly way. It's also, if you want to talk about it in this sense, cost-effective for developers. So if they already know where the sites are, they know where they have to do in-depth surveys, for instance. They can already look into what are the sectors that they have to learn about and have to engage with early on. So I think it's a smart thing to do first, maritime spatial planning and then offshore wind farm from all perspectives. There was one more point that I wanted to say on this, but I can't remember right now, so I would leave Tobias if you want to say something on this.
I think I agree with Anna. Whether you have a maritime spatial plan or you just do maritime spatial planning, I think it's very few. Of course, I don't know how it is in every other country, but I think you always do some sort of planning exercise, seeing what's actually in the area, what kind of problems, challenges can we run into. But the way our challenges have increased in complexity because we need far more areas, far larger areas for offshore wind compared to 20 years ago. You almost can't do successful planning unless you do some sort of maritime spatial planning. And having the MSP as a tool, which was also one of my points, has created this central place where the planning is happening instead of it being sector by sector, that the Environmental Protection Agency might have some plans on environmental protection. The fishing authorities have some plans on fishing and shipping lanes. You have to go to the Danish Maritime Authority to find out where the shipping lanes are. Having all this in one, you might say, one document or one tool is really important for the practical aspects of spatial planning.
Thanks. I think that's put on the spot for the end of this webinar. I just want to say again also that I learned yesterday that when listening to representatives from Fiji, Thailand, China, France, Brazil, they have claimed that MSP should be a key strategic and practical policy, and it should be integrated into national policy. So I think we can have hopes. It's a very complex topic from what I learned, and there's no blueprint for an MSP, so I hope we can all take this along. I thank you all for joining today. It was very interesting. We are even short in time already. Please reach out if you have more questions. With GINGR, we will have another webinar coming up on the 25th of June on monitoring biodiversity. I think Eston put the link into the chat. If you have other questions, you can always reach out to the speakers. You can reach out to me and ask for the slides. We will share the presentations. And thank you all for joining today.